Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. So thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here. I just arrived in Malaysia at around noon today. It's my first time in Malaysia. And I've been a monk for 20 years and have been the Abbot of Abhayagiri Buddhist Monastery for the last 4.5 years. And I've been in Thailand taking a break from that. So last 6 months, last December, I went to Thailand and I've been there ever since, and I'll be going back to America the first half of July. And so I did want to take this opportunity to come to Malaysia and do at least a short trip to Malaysia to come and check it out and see people here. And I've already recognized a few people from this online retreat and on Zoom teachings, but it's so much better to be here in person and meet in person. And over the last 3 years, I've done so many online teachings, and it's kind of the best we could do, but being in person is so much better, in my opinion. And as a teacher, I find teaching online very exhausting. And I don't know exactly why that is, but I would led this 3 years in a row, led this 10-day. Well, actually, the first 2 were 10 days, and then the third year was a 7-day Thanksgiving retreat. It's an annual retreat we've always offered at Abhayagiri. And I was so exhausted by the end of it, doing these things online 10-day retreats. Then there was this online retreat in 2021. It was a hybrid where it was online and in person. And that was extra exhausting. And so it's nice just to be doing these teachings in person. It's quite refreshing. So Dhamma is all about ending suffering and trying to be more happy. And so one thing I wanted to talk about this evening was right view and the importance of developing right view, maybe to use a couple of examples to show what right view is and to help us get our minds around right view, and hopefully, and with that teaching on right view, help us to be inspired to practice. And from the outset, it's good to know that if we want to know about right view, we have to realize that we do have wrong view, and that's okay. It's not about judging ourselves. The Buddha is never judging us, but the Buddha does want us to cultivate right view. So we have to, from the outset, be very forgiving with ourselves, take things slowly, one step at a time, learn how to relax, not be too heavy-hearted about practice. Sometimes we can be worried that we're not getting everything right. We're not doing every single little thing right in the meditation teaching, or we've had various instructions from various teachers and various ajahns, and we aren't quite getting it right. And we might feel bad about that. We might feel heavy-hearted about that. So from the outset, it's good to just learn how to relax, take a few deep breaths, and then just start from the beginning. Each day, just begin again, and try to cultivate this right view. So what's happening is we want to be happy. Everybody wants to be happy. This is universal. All people of all religions want to be happy, want to suffer less. So this can play itself out in various ways. So even a sadomasochist, through causing pain to themselves at some part of their mind, thinks that's going to bring happiness, thinks that is going to lead to happiness, that's going to bring happiness somehow. So everybody wants happiness, everybody wants to be free from suffering. That's a universal human trait, or you could even say it's a trait of all beings. However, what we're doing to make ourselves happy, more often than not, is actually leading to more suffering, because we don't yet realize that our actions of body, speech, and mind, what we're doing, is actually increasing our suffering. But there's something inside of us which is telling us that it's actually going to increase our happiness. This is what the Buddha called the defilements of greed, hatred, delusion. So if, I'm greedy for something, and it might like hurt somebody else for me to have what I want, but that greed is saying, well, it doesn't matter if it hurts the other person. If you get what you want, you're going to be happier. And then say I actually, hurt this other person, get what I want, and then maybe there's a brief moment of satisfaction, and then it's back to wanting the next thing. So we can actually see that these things don't actually lead to happiness. That's called mindfulness, when we start to see that. So some things we're doing actually are leading to happiness, but we don't realize it. So it's easy to get confused. So we have a certain amount of happiness and suffering in our life. It's not all suffering. We have some happiness and some suffering. The happiness, the Buddha's teaching that the happiness came about from good karma, good actions. The unhappiness, the suffering came about from bad karma, bad actions. But the idea is actually, with cultivating right view, is to actually learn how to see this for ourselves. When we learn how to see this for ourselves, then we can start planting the causes in the present for future happiness and for the lessening of suffering. Once we actually are able to start doing that, then things can get quite a bit better quite quickly. So this is what the Buddha taught as Sila Samadhi Panya, where we're holding precepts. However, holding precepts is going to be difficult to do in any sustainable way if we don't yet have right view. If we don't really believe that the precepts are going to help us somehow, it's going to be very hard to sustain it. So the Buddha said, Sila Saddha Sampanno, the precepts are fulfilled through faith. We have to have faith at first. But then over time, when we hold the precepts for a long time, it's going to be different for everybody. It could be 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, or longer. Then we have what's called confirmed faith, where we realize, okay, we start, that benefit starts coming back to us, and then it starts feeding on itself. So right view is when we start to see the right view of kamma. We gain insight into kamma. This is really central to the Buddha's teachings. And again, it's not just through trying to convince ourselves that these things are right, but it's actually starting to see, oh yeah, when I'm generous, I actually do feel good. Oh yeah, when I speak kindly to someone, I actually do feel good. Oh yeah, when I refrain from lying, I actually don't have any suffering associated with if I was to tell a lie and had to protect my story with this person and remember what I told that person. Oh yeah, if I don't drink, I have so much more money, and I'm so much happier, and I'm so much more clear-headed. And wow, okay, that's the 5th precept. Okay, that's interesting. Actually, that comment about drinking kind of segues into probably a good analogy. Something I just learned about beer, and it's quite funny actually, and it dovetails. I think it dovetails well with the teaching about right view, because it shows how easy it is to misunderstand things. So I'm going to use this analogy, and some people may or may not connect with this, but say you want to say a guy wants to be more manly. So you think, well, I'm going to drink beer. I'm going to be, men drink beer. That's what men do. And so I had a lot of friends like this. I was like this before I ordained. Oh yeah, let's drink beer. And that's a manly thing to do. That's kind of like you're out with the guys. And but then it turns out beer actually spikes your estrogen levels and makes you less manly. So it actually has the opposite effect. So you actually had wrong view, thinking drinking beer was going to make you more manly. It actually, in reality, the truth, the scientific truth, is that it actually makes you less manly. So that's one way maybe you can understand right view. And so apologies if anybody here likes drinking beer, but it's actually, you can look it up and study it for yourself, and if you want. So I thought that's a very good analogy for right view and wrong view. And so many things are like that, with some things that we are doing that we think, and we could be very convinced that it's going to lead to our happiness, and it ends up compounding our suffering. And it's pretty amazing that we have the Buddha to have pointed these things out to us and actually discovered these things for himself, because I don't think anybody, I know I couldn't figure these things out on my own. So it's great that we have the Buddha's teaching, that the Buddha was able to figure these things out and say, okay, well, this is what's right, this is what's wrong. Right meaning leads to happiness, wrong meaning leads to more suffering, compounds the suffering. So that's like a basic overview. Of course, there's many details one could get into, and you could give long lectures and classes about right view and wrong view. But just remembering that analogy about beer, just thinking it's just a basic misunderstanding, and we really have to look into things. We really have to use mindfulness to see and notice what's the results of our actions. The Buddha gave us that basic framework of the precepts. If we look into it, if we take the 5 precepts, for example, not killing, say if we don't kill, then we might think, oh, these 5 precepts is just a small thing. You know, it's not really a big deal. It's not changing my life so much. But just think, if you have the precept of not killing, you've already cut out all the suffering that might ensue if you were to kill living beings. If you keep the precept of not stealing, you cut out all the suffering that might ensue, that will ensue from if you were stealing. So it's like, it's hard to see that which we don't have. So it's hard to see the suffering we don't have. And it's good to notice that, if we're precept keepers, to notice the huge amount of suffering that we don't have because we keep these precepts. And so these precepts are, the Buddha taught them because they came from right view. This is the way to cultivate our actions of body and speech, and that is in line with Dhamma, that's going to lead to greater happiness and less suffering. So again, it's important to know the Buddha is not judging us, and it's important to not get too heavy-hearted about these things, and to have a certain lightness, and to be very, very forgiving with ourselves and others. Harmony is very important. Another thing that we can see that causes suffering is attachment to views. Right view has different subtle characters or subtle levels to it. So attachment to views, this is called ditthi-mana. And attachment to views is something that if we don't let go of it, we can't stop suffering, according to the Buddha. So the worldly, say having worldly views, like I'm right, you're wrong, this is what's right, that's not right, I'm right to do this, you're not right to do that. You should be this political affiliation and not that political affiliation. This one's good, that one's bad. And so that's the worldly way of judging things. This is all ditthi-mana. Ditthi-mana is very, very hard to give up. But the Buddha said if we can't give it up, we can't really stop suffering. So it is good to have insight into it and to see it. And the important thing with practice is to see the suffering of it. So if we have a view or an opinion, or we're at odds with, say, a family member or a friend, especially, say, these past few years, there can be a lot of different ways of seeing things, and to see the suffering of it. And the Buddha has this radical statement in the suttas where he says, I hold a view by which I do not contend with anyone in the world. So the Buddha said, I have a view of the nature that I do not contend with anyone in the world. The world may contend with me, but I do not contend with anyone in the world. That's a very radical statement. So how can we have a view that we don't, what type of view would cause us to not contend with anyone else in the world? How can that be? And then the Buddha goes on to say, the view of this is suffering, this is the cause of suffering, this is the cessation of suffering, this is the path leading to the cessation of suffering, this is the view by which there is no contention, because he's always bringing it back to himself. So with right view, we're always bringing it back to ourselves, our own hearts, and seeing what is the results of our actions, what causes suffering, what brings well-being and happiness. It's not so apparent, it's not so easy to see. That's why we meditate, that's why we cultivate mindfulness. Coming to Malaysia, it was a little bit interesting for me. I like to come to a different country or a different culture I haven't been to before, and to see differences. And when I came to Malaysia and we were driving down the highway, could tell I wasn't in Thailand anymore, but I couldn't really put my finger on it. There's just different ways people are being, and the traffic is a bit different, and everything is a bit different. But one thing I noticed was people putting their hands over their heart. And so when I walked by people, they would put their hands over their heart, and I was kind of, they don't do that in Thailand. And so went to visit somebody in the hospital after my arrival today, and went in, and there was like a security guard, and they put their hand over their heart. And so I didn't know what to do. I didn't know if I should also put my hand over my heart, maybe like in response, or if that was appropriate for a monk to do or not, and wasn't sure, so I had to ask about it. But it did also cause another reflection to come up about the Ajahns in Thailand, the Kruba Ajahns. A lot of their teachings are all about the heart. So for me, it was a nice gesture, because it's like remembering that it's all here, it's all in the heart. All the suffering comes from the heart, all the happiness comes from the heart, the path comes from the heart, the defilements come from the heart. This is a huge emphasis. All the Kruba Ajahns in Thailand, and the ones like Lumpur Cha, Lumpur Ban, and the other, also the more modern Ajahns, Lumpur Dun and Lumpur Anan, Lumpur Biak, and others, Lumpur Pasano, Lumpur Sumedo, it's all, and Lumpur Sumedo puts a lot of emphasis on it, that it's all here. He talks about his visit to Luang Pu Khao, a very senior disciple of Ajahn Mun, and Ajahn Khao being on his deathbed and super radiant, super bright, and just amazingly radiant, radiating peace and metta, and just saying, the only thing he said was, it's all here, it's all here. And Luang Pu Sumedo was really, when Luang Pu Cha had taken him to see Luang Pu Khao, so Luang Pu Sumedo was very, very moved by that, and taught that a lot since then. So that's another part of right view, is that it's the suffering we experience is coming from inside. It's not coming from anything outside. So although it is good to have suitable conditions for practice, at a certain point the conditions have to be good enough, and we can't continue to try to change things outside. So the suffering we experience, the dissatisfaction we experience, or a particular translation I like of Ajahn Amaro's, that of dukkha, the not quite rightness that we're experiencing is coming from inside. And it's not coming from the government, the society, any problems in the world, even any disagreement, views of other people, it's not actually coming from that, even though it seems like that's where the suffering is coming from. So if we were to talk about wrong view, we would say wrong view would be that suffering is coming from outside. Right view would be that suffering is caused by craving, desire, coming from inside. So there's suffering, the cause of suffering. The cause of suffering, the Buddha talks about 3 types of tanha. We could just simplify it by just saying craving or unwholesome craving. We could say unwholesome craving. But normally, what we truly believe, we have to see what we truly believe. What we truly believe is that person is the cause of suffering. This situation is the cause of suffering. This disease is the cause of suffering. This presidential candidate is the cause of my suffering. This other monk is the cause of my suffering. This parent is the cause of my suffering. This child is the cause of my suffering. But the Buddha brings it back and said, no, none of those are the cause of suffering. None of those are actually the cause of suffering. The cause of suffering is craving. So that simple reminder we can give ourselves that it's actually coming from inside. But it's so convincing. It just so much seems like it's coming from outside. It's coming from inside. Again, though, this is not to blame ourselves and say, well, it's all my fault. And my suffering is all my fault. I made all sorts of bad karma in the past. In my past lives, I must have done something really bad to this person. That's why they're treating me that way. So we don't want to get into this blaming ourselves. But just seeing what we're doing is we're not blaming ourselves, but we're empowering ourselves. Because if it's coming from inside, we can do something about it. If it's coming from outside, we can not change things outside, or maybe just only a tiny bit. We can expend a lot of energy and not be successful in changing the outside world. But if we take that same amount of energy, we can actually train ourselves, and that's going to fix the problem. So that's also part of right view, is that acknowledgement that the suffering is coming from inside and we can do something about it, and that it's not coming from the outside. So that's about all I want to say about right view. It might be nice to open up for questions, because I'm not quite sure maybe where people are at, or if people want, if you want clarification or want to ask something completely unrelated to what I just talked about, then that would be fine.
Hi, Ajahn. Thank you for your talk. A view that I recently have been reflecting on is about parents. And what you said about suffering coming from a parent, that has been a major view for me. And so recently I've been reflecting on how it actually comes from me, but it's very hard to completely drop sort of like the idea that I think we all grow up with, that parents are like meant to be our safe space and people that we can rely on and depend on. And I think as we grow older, we realize that's not true, and that they're very flawed. And it's a very disappointing realization. I think I just wanted to hear your reflections on that.
Yeah, it's a very good reflection and question, because these things are very nuanced. It's not that we never try to change the outside world. So for example, if you have an abusive parent or you're in an abusive relationship, you have to try to get out of that if you can. The conditions have to be good enough to be able to, the external world has to be good enough to be able to reflect that the suffering's not coming truly from the external world. So there's the ultimate teaching, which is, yes, it's all coming from the heart. But then there's also the relative teaching that we do have to have conditions that are good enough. Conditions do matter, but we don't want to put all of our attention into trying to create the most perfect conditions possible. We want conditions that are just good enough. But certainly if there's a relationship or there's some sort of situation where where you're in extreme pain and can't even reflect on these things, then of course you can't practice in that situation, and you need to find some way to get out of it. But that also doesn't mean we can't forgive our parents or even the most abusive of people, because they're also worthy recipients of our compassion and metta. And now that I'm 42, I can reflect on these things, and I think about my own parents. I had really good parents, pretty good upbringing, but they certainly had their blind spots, and so I think about how much we are like our parents, and so for a long time it was hard for me to admit to myself how much I was like my parents. Not just physically, but actually my emotional habits were very similar, and still are in many ways similar to that of my parents. And I didn't want to admit that for a long time, because I thought, oh, they're really emotionally messed up. And then I saw, oh, I'm also really emotionally messed up, but I just didn't want to admit it. And so that's important to see as well, and that can help us be forgiving with them. And it's been that way for a long time with their parents and their parents' parents and so on. It's been this way for a very long time. And parents, a lot of the time, they're just trying to do what they can with whatever views. If they're not Dhamma practitioners, it's just shooting in the dark, and whatever they're doing, they think that it's going to be the best decision. If they have a fight, they're trying to fight over their views or whatever. They both think that if they win the fight, they're going to be happier, and which of course isn't the case. But you still see that right view, wrong view dynamic playing out. And so yeah, it's a tough one. I've talked to a lot of people who have been in abusive relationships or had difficult relationships with their parents, and it's not always the case that you should be around them. Sometimes you just have to break away, and then if you end up making your life better, maybe they can reflect on it later. They can also, nothing is static. People can change even later on in their life. So parents who maybe, even if they were abusive or emotionally abusive, that's a very common one these days, they can, maybe through your practice, not through talking to them directly, but sometimes you could just set a good example and they might reflect on themselves eventually. Nobody has any doubts, any questions?
Yeah, maybe while the audience is still thinking of their question, maybe I could ask one of my own, Ajahn. In Buddhism, we always talk about the middle path, the middle way. But I would like to know, how do you know what is too little and too much? What are the extremes? Is there any way we could gauge that?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And to know the middle way, so in an ultimate sense, it's difficult to know without doing a lot of meditation practice and without practicing for a long time. However, as a general guideline, the precepts, I think, are a good guideline for that the 5 precepts illustrate what the middle way is. The middle way doesn't necessarily mean moderation, because say you have something like the 5th precept, and you get this question in America a lot, well, what about a glass of wine with dinner? And say, well, no, the precept is just nothing. That's the middle way. It's not talking about moderation with alcohol. And so the middle way also, it tends, I think the way the Buddha taught it was, it's a bit more austere than, like we might tend to think it's more like, the middle way the Buddha was teaching, we might think it's tending towards more like too extreme on the austere side, but that's actually the middle way. because most of us in modern times will tend more towards indulgence. And so we need to kind of tone it down a little bit to get, so the middle way is a bit, by our modern standards, it's austere. I think by the Buddhist standards, it's not actually that austere, but by our modern standards, it's a little bit austere. So it's, we do have, the middle way calls for going without in some ways. But it's not that easy to gauge unless we really start to see how the mind is veering towards extremes. Like Luang Por Chah would talk about it as birth and death. Birth is like gladness, death is sadness. So if the mind is going too much into gladness and too much into sadness, it's not in the middle way. It's not really with equanimity. It's not even. Or you hear some ajahns talking about keeping the mind in a state of normality. So sometimes it might happen that somebody comes to the teacher and they might be like, Ajahn, I just had this great meditation and I was up all night, and their kind of eyes are really wide, and that's like off the middle way. So that's not a state of normality. So you hear these ajahns talk a lot about like just be normal, just like stay normal, and that's a good thing. It's not actually about getting these really deep states of samadhi, although perhaps that'll naturally happen later on as the mind naturally settles through the keeping of sila and through the consistent practice. But it's not really about like trying to get these super deep states as quickly as possible, and that'll end up not being the middle way if we try to do it that way. So I think, yeah, maybe to answer your question, just keeping the mind in a normal state and not going too extreme to like extreme happiness or extreme suffering. Staying in the middle, that's the middle way as well.
Thank you for the answer, Tan Ajahn.